Marcus Taylor sat in the modest kitchen of his small apartment, the morning light filtering through the half-open blinds. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the lingering scent of pancakes, which his wife, Eva, had made before she left for her early shift at the hospital. The sound of his daughter, Layla, humming a tune as she got ready for school echoed from the hallway. It was a peaceful morning, one that Marcus had grown accustomed to, but he knew better than to let the calmness fool him. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:45 a.m. He'd only just finished his second cup of coffee, and his mind was already 1,000 miles away, preoccupied with the case that had been eating away at him for weeks. He had always known the job wouldn't be easy, but this was different. The file sat in front of him, closed but never far from his thoughts. Corruption within local law enforcement. It was a messy situation, one that had drawn Marcus into a delicate balancing act. As an FBI agent working undercover, he had to maintain his cover while also navigating the thin line between justice and the ties that bound him to his community. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fog that lingered from a restless night. His job wasn't like the ones most people had. It was more than just a 9-to-5, it was a constant grind. His duties took him into dark corners of the city, chasing down leads, making difficult choices, and living a life that seemed to be more about maintaining secrets than sharing moments with his family. In the quiet of the morning, the weight of it all seemed especially heavy. Marcus had grown up in this neighborhood. He had learned to blend in, to keep his head low, to avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention. While some of his colleagues in the bureau would boast about their high-profile cases and the respect they commanded, Marcus had always found a quiet dignity in living under the radar. He didn't need fame. He didn't need accolades. He just needed to do the work and get home to his family every night. But lately, his job was becoming impossible to separate from his personal life. Eva had noticed it too. The long hours, the mood swings, the unexplained absences. She didn't ask questions, not directly, but he could tell she was worried. And Layla, only 10 years old, could sense when things weren't right. She'd been quieter recently, retreating into herself, asking questions that Marcus didn't know how to answer. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the clock again. He was late. Eva would be calling any minute, and Layla would be waiting at the bus stop. "Marcus, come on." Eva's voice echoed from the hallway. "You know the drill. You've got 5 minutes before you need to go." He sighed, standing up and gathering his things. The case would have to wait, for now. It wasn't as if he had any real answers anyway. The drive to work was a routine Marcus knew well. The streets were mostly quiet, save for the occasional early commuter, and the sun was just beginning to rise high enough to burn off the morning fog. It was one of those rare days when the city seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the undercurrents of tension that flowed just beneath its surface. As Marcus drove through his neighborhood, he passed by familiar faces, Mrs. Johnson sweeping her front steps, the young couple from 2 houses down walking their dog, and the kids waiting for the school bus. The sense of normalcy that came with this life was something Marcus held onto. He couldn't afford to lose it. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and he glanced down at the screen. It was an encrypted message from his handler. The case was escalating. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Local cops were involved, which meant things were going to get complicated fast. Marcus swiped the message away and focused back on the road. His mind drifted back to the file, the details he had uncovered, the crooked officers he was investigating. He had to be careful. He couldn't afford to let anyone, especially not his own department, know what he was doing. But the truth was, he didn't know who to trust anymore. Not after the lies and the betrayals he'd seen from both sides. A few blocks from the office, he was stopped at a red light, his thoughts swirling. Suddenly, the loud sound of a police siren cut through the silence. Marcus looked in his rearview mirror to see a cruiser behind him, the lights flashing in the early morning light. Not today, Marcus muttered under his breath, knowing exactly what was coming. It was the same thing every time. He had become used to the suspicion, the assumptions, the way he was often treated differently because of his skin. Marcus was used to being watched, even when he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had grown up with it. He had become numb to the way some people looked at him, the way some officers treated him as though his mere presence was a threat. The cruiser pulled up beside him, and the officer rolled down his window. Marcus forced a calm expression, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good morning, sir," the officer said, his tone cordial, though Marcus could tell there was something underneath. "License and registration, please." Marcus's brow furrowed. It wasn't even 8 a.m. yet. He had barely been on the road long enough to make a legal turn. But then again, it didn't matter. It never did. He reached into the glove compartment and handed over his documents, his movements deliberate. "Everything in order, officer." The officer glanced at the papers, then back at Marcus. The silence between them grew thicker, more uncomfortable. Marcus could feel the officer's gaze lingering on him, like he was trying to read more than just his driver's license. "You don't mind me asking, Mr. Taylor," the officer continued, his words a little slower now, more deliberate, "what's a guy like you doing driving a car like this?" Marcus blinked, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what the officer was implying. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his right to be in this neighborhood, to drive a car that wasn't some beat-up rust bucket. The officer wasn't asking for an explanation, though. He was trying to provoke one. "I'm on my way to work," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "No problem. Just making sure you're not up to anything suspicious." Marcus's stomach tightened. He recognized that tone. He had heard it before. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something more personal, something more loaded. He took a breath, feeling the familiar weight of the badge tucked into his waistband, hidden from view. "If there's no issue, officer, I'd like to be on my way." The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded, handing back Marcus's papers without another word. But the look lingered, the distrust, the prejudice, the quiet assumption that Marcus was somehow out of place. As Marcus drove off, the cruiser remained behind him for a few blocks before veering off into another direction. His hands clenched the steering wheel, but he didn't let the anger show. He'd been pulled over for no reason. He'd been profiled. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But it didn't change the fact that he had a job to do, a family to care for, and a case that was becoming more dangerous by the day. As Marcus took a deep breath and turned onto the next street, he realized that the real fight wasn't just about solving crimes or uncovering corruption. It was about surviving in a world that always seemed to expect him to be something he wasn't. Marcus had just finished his shift at the hospital, his mind still lingering on the chaos of the ER. Another night of long hours, high-pressure decisions, and lives hanging in the balance. As an orthopedic surgeon, he had seen everything from broken bones to the aftermath of car accidents, but nothing had prepared him for the moment he stepped out of the building to find himself at the mercy of the police. He was already tired. His legs ached from standing for hours, and his mind was clouded with the thought of the long night ahead. The night air was crisp, the kind of chilly breeze that hinted at the start of fall. As Marcus made his way toward his car, he didn't see the squad car pull up behind him, didn't hear the screech of tires until it was too late. "Hey!" The voice cut through the quiet of the night, sharp and accusatory. Marcus froze, turning to see an officer standing a few feet away, his hand already resting on his holstered gun. His partner was a few paces behind, watching silently, hands crossed. Marcus blinked, trying to adjust his thoughts to the new reality. The officer was tall, with a square jaw and a look of determination on his face that made Marcus feel uneasy. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but confused. "You're in the wrong part of town," the officer said, eyes narrowing as if he had already decided who Marcus was before he even spoke. "What are you doing here?" Marcus felt a jolt of confusion. This wasn't his first time in this part of the city. It wasn't dangerous, and he wasn't a stranger to walking around in neighborhoods that weren't typically considered safe. He had been raised in these streets, had spent the better part of his adult life trying to make a difference in communities just like this one. But the officer wasn't concerned with his past. He wasn't interested in who Marcus was, what he had accomplished, or where he was headed. "I'm just leaving work," Marcus said, holding up his keys as though that would explain everything. "I'm a doctor. I work at the hospital down the street." The officer didn't seem impressed. In fact, his expression only darkened. "Uh-huh," the officer muttered, as if Marcus's explanation didn't fit the image he had of him. "What's in your pockets?" Marcus felt a cold knot in his stomach. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't done anything wrong, had no reason to be stopped, no reason for this officer to be asking these questions. He took a step back, instinctively reaching for his wallet. "Just my ID, officer. If you'd like to see it, I can show you." Before Marcus could pull out his identification, the officer's tone shifted, his hand now firmly on his belt, fingers brushing against the handle of his gun. "I didn't ask for your ID," the officer said, his voice tight, filled with authority. "I asked what's in your pockets." Marcus's mind began to race, the tension building in his chest. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on him, his assumptions hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Marcus could sense where this was going. He'd heard the stories, seen the videos, understood the risks. His heart started to beat harder in his chest. He tried to remind himself to stay calm, but his pulse betrayed him. "I don't have anything illegal," Marcus said, taking a slow, deliberate step back, trying to give the officer space. He knew the drill: stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't make any sudden moves. "Then why don't you let me see?" The officer's voice was colder now, sharper, and his partner took a step forward, arms still crossed, eyes scanning Marcus like he was a threat to the neighborhood. Marcus felt a surge of frustration. Was he really being questioned like this, just because of the color of his skin? Because of the hoodie he wore, or the way he looked walking down the street? "I told you, I'm just leaving work," Marcus repeated, his tone growing more insistent, more defensive. "I'm a surgeon. If you don't believe me, I can give you the address to the hospital. I can even call my supervisor." The officer didn't seem to care. He wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in the truth. "You think I'm stupid," the officer shot back, taking a step forward. The space between them closed, the tension in the air palpable. "You're wearing a hoodie and acting all nervous. You fit the description." "Fit the description?" Marcus repeated, unable to keep the incredulity from his voice. Of what? Who are you looking for? I'm looking for someone who doesn't belong here, the officer snapped, his eyes narrowing. Now step aside. Marcus's pulse quickened. The confrontation was escalating, and every instinct told him to de-escalate the situation. He couldn't afford to make any sudden moves, not with the officer's hand still dangerously near his weapon. But how was he supposed to prove his innocence when it seemed like everything about him, his race, his presence here, was enough to make him guilty in the officer's eyes? The second officer, still standing behind the first, finally spoke up. What's the problem, Jim? You don't need to get all aggressive with him. Jim, the officer at the forefront, ignored his partner. Instead, he reached toward Marcus, grabbing his arm with enough force to make Marcus flinch. Hey, let go of me. Marcus said, trying to step back, to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. No one's letting go of anything, buddy. You're coming with us, Jim growled, his words final. Marcus's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flashing in his head. He could feel the fear rising in him, the fear that this situation would spiral out of control, that his career, his future, could be ruined because of an officer's racial prejudices. He had worked his entire life to be where he was, fought through countless barriers to become a respected surgeon in a city where opportunities for black men like him were few and far between. This was not how he had imagined his life turning out. Please, Marcus said, his voice steady but desperate. You're making a mistake. Jim wasn't listening. He pulled out his cuffs, snapping them around Marcus's wrists before he could even fully process what was happening. The cold metal clamped down around his wrists, and Marcus felt the familiar sting of panic. No. No, you don't have to do this, Marcus said, his voice rising now, his chest tight with emotion. He could feel his throat closing as the humiliation of the situation hit him. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being dehumanized, treated like a criminal because of the way he looked. The officer didn't even respond. With a forceful grip, he yanked Marcus toward the squad car, the harsh scrape of the cuffs against his skin sending a jolt of panic through him. He could feel the eyes of the few onlookers who had gathered, standing still in the shadows, uncertain of what was happening, but witnessing every moment. The officer shoved him into the back of the car without a word, slamming the door with enough force to rattle his bones. As the squad car pulled away, the bright lights flashing behind him like a constant reminder of his new reality, Marcus struggled to keep his mind from spinning. His heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He had to figure out how to get out of this, but he couldn't make any mistakes. He couldn't reveal who he really was until the situation was under control. His career, his life, were all on the line now. The worst part was, no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried to explain, there was nothing he could do to erase the officer's assumptions. There was nothing he could do to change the bias that had already been cast on him. It was only a matter of time before he'd have to decide how much of himself he was willing to give up to survive this night. The car lurched forward, and the darkness closed in around him. The real fight had just begun. The cold metal of the jail cell door slammed shut behind Marcus with a deafening finality. His body sagged against the wall, the concrete unforgiving under his weight. He didn't have the energy to move, not yet. The adrenaline that had surged through him earlier when he had been yanked from the street, thrown to the ground, and cuffed had long since worn off. All that was left now was a hollow emptiness that gnawed at his insides. The flashing lights from outside had dimmed when the doors of the squad car slammed shut. The precinct had swallowed him whole, a nameless face in a system that didn't care about who he really was. He wasn't Marcus Williams anymore. He was just the latest headline. The latest criminal. Through the bars of his cell, he could hear the faint hum of a television from the precinct lobby, the murmur of reporters' voices filtering into the otherwise silent room. He didn't need to see it to know what was being said. He could already feel it, the weight of the world on him, crushing him, suffocating him. Local man arrested in violent encounter with police officer. Another black man escalates a routine traffic stop into chaos. The dangers of reckless resistance. Officer praised for bravery. The words felt like a slap to his face every time the headlines ran through his mind. Local man. Reckless. There was no mention of the truth, no mention of Marcus being an FBI agent. No mention of the mission that had led him to this place, this moment. No mention of the fact that he was just trying to make sure things didn't escalate further. He had been in control until the officer grabbed him. Until the situation spiraled out of his hands. In the eyes of the public, he was just another black man caught up in a system that had been engineered to vilify him. Another statistic in a long line of tragic incidents where the truth didn't matter, only the narrative did. Marcus clenched his fists. The anger bubbled inside him, hot and relentless. He wasn't just angry about the arrest. He was angry at how easy it had been for the media to paint him as the villain. How his race, his background, had become the defining factors in a story where his own identity had no place. Out there, the officer who'd arrested him was a hero. His name, his face, plastered on every news outlet. The city rallied behind him, the local community flooding social media with praise for the officer's bravery in subduing an aggressive suspect. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Marcus wasn't a criminal. He wasn't just some random guy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a fucking FBI agent. The thought twisted in Marcus' gut, a constant, gnawing reminder of just how deep the hole was that he dug for himself. If anyone found out the truth, if the wrong person discovered who he really was, his career, his entire life, could be shattered. The Bureau didn't take kindly to agents who were caught in the wrong light. The idea of exposing himself, of telling the truth, felt like stepping into a death trap. His colleagues at the FBI had no idea what had happened. They wouldn't even know until it was too late. No one could help him. No one was coming. The hours dragged on. Marcus sat in the cold, the weight of the situation sinking in. His phone had been taken from him, leaving him disconnected from the world outside. All he had was the small sliver of a window high on the wall, offering him no view but the stark gray of the concrete walls. The door to the holding area opened suddenly. The sharp clack of boots against the floor echoed off the walls. Marcus lifted his head, trying to focus his blurry eyes on the figure stepping into the room. It was one of the officers who had been at the scene earlier, a thick-set man with a grizzled face. "What do you want?" Marcus' voice was rough, unused to the silence of the cell. The officer's expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Just wanted to check on you," he said, almost mockingly. "You know, make sure you're okay after that incident earlier." He let the word hang in the air, his tone laced with thinly veiled disdain. Marcus' eyes narrowed. "I'm fine. Just waiting to get out of here." "Yeah, well, don't hold your breath." The officer smirked and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You're pretty high profile now, man. Don't know if you've seen the news yet, but you're all over it." Another black man, resisting arrest. That's the new headline. Kind of makes you look, well, not too good. The words felt like a punch in the gut. Marcus wanted to lash out, to scream, to tell this man everything, how he'd been trying to de-escalate the situation, how he was not just another statistic, how none of this should have happened. But he couldn't. He had to stay quiet. Had to play along. The officer's voice dropped lower, almost as if speaking to himself. Funny thing, though. I've heard some people talking. The way the crowd reacted when you were arrested. Some people say you were involved in something bigger. But they're all saying the same thing about you, that you're just a dangerous criminal. Marcus wanted to laugh, a bitter, humorless chuckle. They didn't know the half of it. He wanted to say something, to fight back against the lie, but he swallowed his words. There was no point. Not when every word could twist back on him. Not when this officer, and so many others, were going to spin this as something it wasn't. Before he could respond, the officer turned, giving him one last look. You're lucky, though. That officer who arrested you. He's a local hero now. They've been sending him flowers. You're not the first person to make a mess out of something, but you sure did give him a good reason to call it all out. The officer left, and Marcus was alone again. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. His fingers gripped the bars as he stared out into the nothingness, his thoughts swirling in a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. The pressure of keeping the truth hidden weighed on him like a crushing burden, but it wasn't just the FBI that he feared losing. It was his identity, the very essence of who he was, torn between two worlds, neither of which would ever accept him fully. It felt like there was no way out. No way to undo the damage. As the hours ticked by and the night stretched on, Marcus realized that his silence would be both his shield and his curse. The world was watching, and he was trapped, caught in a story that had already been written. Marcus felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him, thick and suffocating. The parking lot outside the precinct had descended into a storm of flashing lights and anxious murmurs, the press circling like vultures. Inside, the room was no less chaotic. Officers milled about, their hushed voices barely concealing their nervous energy as they prepared to take him in. He'd known it was coming, this inevitable moment when the truth could no longer stay hidden. But as he stood in the center of the interrogation room, the door closed behind him with a finality that made his heart race. He wasn't sure whether he was ready. The police officer who'd initiated the arrest, Detective Harris, a tall man with a square jaw and a reputation for being hard-nosed, was still glaring at him, his arms crossed and his posture rigid. The tension between them felt palpable, as if the air itself was charged with some unseen force. "Let's make this quick, Agent Cole," Harris said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've got a job to do. You don't get to play hero here. Not on my watch." Marcus stood tall, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. It had taken everything within him not to lash out. This wasn't just a matter of self-preservation anymore, it was about something bigger, something that had weighed on him for far too long. He wasn't just an FBI agent in this moment. He wasn't just a black man in a system that had a habit of treating him differently. He was a man who had seen enough injustice to know that silence would only perpetuate it. "Detective," Marcus began, his voice steady, even though his nerves were running raw. "I think it's time I show you who I really am." Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What, you planning to pull some kind of last-minute card to get out of this?" "I'm not interested in your excuses." But Marcus had already reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his FBI credentials with a deliberate slowness. The gold seal caught the dim light of the room, its weight much heavier than it had ever felt before. I'm not trying to get out of anything, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'm here to clear this up. Harris hesitated for a split second, his gaze flicking from Marcus to the ID, his face betraying a flicker of disbelief. You're an FBI agent. His voice wavered slightly. Marcus nodded. I am. And I need you to verify that with your supervisor. The detective blinked, his brow furrowing as he reluctantly pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the precinct's watch commander. Marcus stood silently as the call went through, the seconds stretching into what felt like eternity. Harris glanced back at him, his expression guarded, then turned his attention back to the phone. I've got a situation here, Harris said gruffly, repeating Marcus's credentials into the receiver. The conversation was short and clipped, but when he ended the call and lowered the phone, his earlier confidence had begun to crack. His voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. You're who you say you are? Harris asked, his tone less forceful, more confused than anything else. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Harris in the eye, allowing the silence to hang between them. He wasn't about to explain himself further. This wasn't about justifying who he was. This was about making Harris realize that his entire approach to the situation had been wrong. Yes, I am, Marcus finally answered, his tone calm but unwavering. For a long moment, Harris simply stared at him, his mind clearly processing the reality of the situation. The tables had turned. Marcus had come here to defuse a volatile situation, to show that he wasn't the enemy, that his presence in this precinct wasn't an intrusion but a call for cooperation. But as the realization settled over Harris, Marcus understood that the damage was already done. The arrest, the accusations, the hostility, all of it had been fueled by something much deeper than a mere misunderstanding. It was about race. It was about power. And now, it was about the difficult truth that even when Marcus revealed the truth about who he was, the focus didn't immediately shift in his favor. Why didn't you say something sooner? Harris asked, his voice tinged with a defensive edge. Marcus shook his head slowly. Because I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to prove who I am just because of the color of my skin. That's the problem, Harris. You assumed I was the threat when I walked in the door, not because of what I'd done, but because of what you thought I might be. The detective's jaw tightened. He was no longer looking at Marcus with the same certainty he had earlier, but the damage had already been done. The arrest was already a headline, a hot topic on every news channel in the city, and there was no way to undo the public perception that Marcus was a threat before his identity had been revealed. The racial prejudice that had tainted the situation could not be wiped away with a badge and an apology. I didn't know who you were, Harris muttered, still not entirely convinced. I just did what I thought was right. Right, Marcus repeated, his voice low. But the problem is, what you thought was right wasn't about the truth. It wasn't about who I am or what I stand for. It was about me being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Harris was silent, no response coming to mind. His mind was clearly whirring, but nothing he said could change what had already been set into motion. Marcus knew, though, that the moment he'd revealed his identity wasn't the moment that everything was fixed. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The community's reaction to the incident had shifted almost immediately. What had started as an arrest of a seemingly unknown man had now become an issue of racial profiling, public distrust, and law enforcement's ability to hold its own officers accountable. Marcus had already seen the articles online, headline after headline, calling for an investigation into how this had escalated. They weren't asking the right questions yet, though. The questions should have been about the systemic issues within law enforcement, the prejudice that colored every interaction, the tension that ran beneath the surface of every decision. They weren't just asking about him, they were asking about all the men like him, the ones who walked into situations where their very presence was suspect. But this fight was bigger than one arrest. It wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about changing a system that had never allowed people like him to simply exist without suspicion. And for all the clarity Marcus had in that moment, the real challenge lay ahead, pushing for change while carrying the weight of 1,000 expectations. "Get your things," Harris said after a beat, the defeat in his voice evident now. "You're free to go. I'll make sure your release is processed." Marcus didn't move at once. Instead, he let the words hang in the air, knowing this wouldn't be the last time his identity would be questioned. But he was ready now. Ready to confront the ugly truths, ready to face the long road ahead. "Don't mistake my freedom for forgiveness," Marcus said quietly, his voice laced with both conviction and warning. "I'm not done yet." The storm had come quickly, and it showed no signs of letting up. The revelation that Marcus was an FBI agent had barely made its way through the media when the floodgates of public scrutiny opened. News outlets picked apart his every move, and social media ran wild with theories and accusations. How could someone entrusted with upholding justice have been the target of such blatant racial profiling? How had a seasoned law enforcement officer ended up in handcuffs, his rights ignored, his dignity stripped away? The answers were as elusive as ever. And now, Marcus was in the eye of a hurricane he couldn't escape. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone screen, which buzzed incessantly with messages. The local news had been relentless, and the public outcry was palpable. A mix of anger and confusion filled the airwaves. Questions about his arrest. Questions about the officer involved. Questions about the system itself. "Marcus, are you okay?" Lena's text message flashed on the screen. He couldn't bring himself to respond, not yet, at least. Not until the barrage of questions from his own colleagues and the media had settled into something more manageable. The phone rang, the harsh ring slicing through the tension in the room. It was Sarah, his partner in both work and life. He could hear the concern in her voice even before he answered. "Marcus, I saw the news. What's going on? What happened with the officer?" she asked, her tone a blend of frustration and confusion. She had seen him through countless difficult cases, but this was different. "I don't know yet," Marcus said quietly, his voice low and tight with the weight of everything crashing down on him. "The officer involved is on administrative leave, but the damage is already done. They've turned this into a public spectacle." Sarah sighed, the sound heavy with the understanding of the deeper problem. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" Marcus shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "No. This isn't about me anymore. It's about the system. About how people like me, black men in law enforcement, are still treated like criminals. The questions they're asking now are about why I was arrested in the first place. Why didn't I just walk away? Why didn't I do this or that differently? They're not asking the right questions, Sarah." It was true. The immediate questions from both the media and the public weren't about the officer's behavior or the systemic racism that had led to Marcus's arrest. They were about him, why he hadn't been able to avoid the situation, why he hadn't de-escalated it better. Even his colleagues in the FBI, many of whom had worked alongside him for years, were now questioning how a seasoned agent had let himself become a target. The internal investigation was in its infancy, but the damage was already evident. Marcus could feel the cold distance from his fellow agents, the uncomfortable glances and the hushed conversations behind his back. There were murmurs that perhaps he had crossed a line somewhere in his handling of the situation, that maybe he had provoked the officer in question. He could feel his stomach knotting as the thoughts swirled in his mind. Was there something I could have done differently? A knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. When he opened it, his partner in the field, Jason, stood there. The tall, broad-shouldered man had been there for him in some of the most difficult moments of his career. But today, his eyes were clouded with uncertainty. "Got a minute?" Jason asked, stepping into the apartment without waiting for a response. "We need to talk about your statement to the press." Marcus sighed, a tension in his shoulders. "I don't have much to say right now, Jason. I'm trying to focus on the work, not all this media noise." Jason, always the pragmatist, leaned against the wall. "That's the problem, Marcus. People are talking. They're talking about the system, about how you got dragged into this mess, and how you're a symbol now. Whether you like it or not, you're a part of this conversation. And you're gonna have to take a stand one way or another." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. He knew Jason was right, but the weight of it all felt suffocating. The last thing he wanted was to become the poster child for racial injustice within law enforcement. But that was exactly what was happening. The moment the story had hit the news, the lines between his identity as an FBI agent and as a black man had blurred. Now he was both. The system had chosen him as the face of the broken system. "I'm tired of being the example, Jason. I'm tired of it." His voice wavered despite his best efforts to sound resolute. Jason's expression softened. "I know, man. But think about this. The system's been broken for a long time. You're just the one who got caught up in it. And now, you have a chance to show people what's really going on. You can either shrink away from this or use it to change things." Marcus stared at the floor, unsure of how to respond. He had spent his career navigating the delicate balance between his two worlds, the FBI and the community he came from. But now, he was questioning whether the two could ever truly coexist. The backlash from both sides was enough to break anyone. "I don't know if I can handle the heat, Jason. Every day, it feels like I'm being torn apart. The media, the people at the office, even my friends, they all expect me to be something I don't know if I am anymore." Jason stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You've always been strong, man. This is the test. I know it's hard, but you have to find a way through it. Whatever happens, you can't lose yourself in the process." Marcus nodded slowly, but the uncertainty lingered. Every move felt like it carried weight now. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and his career could be over. And what about his relationship with Sarah? He couldn't even begin to imagine how this would affect her. "I'm not sure what the right move is," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe the right move is just being honest with yourself for once," Jason said quietly, "and trusting that everything else will fall into place." The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it also gave him something he hadn't had for a while, a moment of clarity. He could feel the weight of the system pressing down on him, but maybe it was time to stop trying to shoulder it alone. He was part of something bigger than himself, but that didn't mean he had to lose himself in the process. As he stood by the window, looking out at the skyline of DC, Marcus knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, the fight for justice was no longer just about his career. It was about something much larger. And if he was going to survive this, He had to be prepared to pay the cost of speaking out, no matter how high that cost might be. The question wasn't whether he was ready for the consequences. The question was whether the world was ready for the truth. Marcus sat in his car, parked at the edge of the FBI parking lot, staring at the windshield, but not really seeing anything. His mind was a storm, chaotic, heavy with thoughts he couldn't seem to control. His body, too, felt worn. He hadn't slept well in days. His back ached from long hours hunched over case files. His head throbbed with the constant pressure of decisions he didn't feel prepared to make. Every inch of him felt heavy, like the badge he wore around his neck was made of lead instead of metal. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of his unshaven skin. He'd been avoiding his reflection in mirrors lately, knowing it would only remind him of how much he was starting to unravel. The man he had been, calm, controlled, always in the thick of things, was slipping away. In his place was someone uncertain, someone afraid. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his daze. He pulled it out to find a message from Agent Hayward. "We need to talk. Now." Marcus sighed and tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat, running his fingers through his hair. He knew what this was about. The pressure was mounting. The investigation into the officers involved in the shooting was reaching a boiling point. Public outcry had only grown louder, and the FBI, as always, was desperate to show they were doing something. But Marcus was torn. He had spent years trying to believe in the system, to do the right thing from within, to make the changes he had always told himself were possible. But now, in the face of so much corruption and systemic failure, he wasn't sure he could keep up the fight. A knock on his window startled him. Marcus jumped, then rolled it down, meeting the familiar, worried gaze of Special Agent Claire Morgan. "You okay?" she asked, her tone soft but direct. It was the kind of question friends asked, not colleagues. The kind of question Marcus didn't want to answer. He hesitated, then forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah. Just tired." Morgan didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she leaned against the car, arms crossed. "You know, I've been hearing things. The department's on your back. Public opinion's shifting. You're getting